Peter Kyle, lovely of you to join me.
Thanks for having me.
You're dyslexic, and I want to talk about your experience of dyslexia. You were put into a remedial class at school. Tell me what happened.
Well, I was at secondary school. I went to, I think what Alistair Campbell used to call a bog standard comprehensive school in the 80s. It was a very kind of Grange Hill experience. And they just didn't know what to do with me, is the truth, because I wasn't succeeding at school, and yet I was socially quite likeable and quite active and capable. And yet when it came to submitting work, it was pretty illegible and it wasn't coherent, and there were some mistakes you would expect from people who aren't socially aware. So they just didn't know quite what to do with me. So I went through all these different things, and I was put in different streams and different classes. And then I ended up in remedial, which is just a class back then at the end of school where you would do an extra hour or so of work. So I would be in a classroom, standing at the front of the class on the blackboard at the time, and just doing these repetitive, making shapes like loops across the blackboard and filling it up and then rubbing it out and doing another shape all the way across. But remedial was also for people who had behavioural problems. So most of the people that ended up there had behavioural problems. So I was there at the front doing these loops, and there were chairs coming across because their fights would always break out. The teacher really didn't want to be in the room because it was a difficult room to be in. So the teacher would always make an excuse to get out, and there'd be this crashing and banging and walloping, and I would be trying to do these things so I could just get out of the room. So that was what it was like. I didn't know what it was. Nobody mentioned the word dyslexia. I just knew it wasn't working. So it was difficult.
You're 51 now, and so it's a fair amount of time ago, but still not very long ago at all.
Well, what was long? I'll say what there is a lasting memory is, I mean, I think the most powerful human emotion is humiliation. And there was a couple of moments in my secondary education where I was just outright humiliated for not being able to read properly. And there's one moment where a teacher stood up, and we were in English and we were doing Shakespeare. And suddenly, even though we weren't reading aloud, and we were just reading the text and talking about the text, the teacher suddenly said, "Peter, why don't you just stand up and read this chapter?" And I was so shocked, because the teacher would have known full well that I wasn't capable of doing it, and asked me to do so. And the teacher was falling about laughing as I was doing it one word at a time with the pause and getting words wrong. But I remember very well looking around the room, and there was a couple of kids who were sniggering, but most of the kids were with me. You know, they were as humiliated as I was. But that was the moment that I just switched off education. I just realized that I'm going to turn up, I'm going to get out as quickly as I can, but that's just not for me. So that is the moment. You know, when you say a long time ago, so many of those memories will have dimmed, they have. But when you are humiliated, that's something that stays with you for life. And that was one of those really key pivotal moments for me, particularly at school, and my approach to schooling the first time around.
You must be angry.
No, I wasn't angry, because I'm not an angry person. I wasn't angry then. I just dealt with it in my own way. But don't forget, I had to, you know, I left school, and this is the thing that's just driven me. I left school having not learned how to learn. I stumbled into work. I ended up working at the Body Shop. Anita Roddick, I was the lowest paid person. What I had to do to get that job is a story in itself. I was the lowest paid person in the company, but because I worked on a Sunday, because I wanted to keep up and do with all my work without people knowing, I met Anita Roddick because she was the only other person that was working in the company on a Sunday. I didn't know I was dyslexic at the time, but I knew I had to do more than other people just to get by. And that was when we connected. She mentored me. When I was 25, she was the first person in my life to say, "You should go to university." So I had to ended up, because I get rejected from university, I had to go back to the same secondary school at the age of 25 and spend a year just starting all over again. And that process was what politicized me. But it was also the process when I finally got into university. I ended up coming out with a degree and a PhD 6 years later. And that was the moment that I learned how to learn, was at university. And that is what turned around my life. You know, that's what created huge opportunities for me. Anita Roddick was the first individual that ever saw something in me that I didn't see. Sussex University, when I finally got in there, was the first institution that saw something in me that I didn't see and found a way of unlocking it.
That's really quite moving to hear.
But it's also why I'm so passionate about social mobility. It's why education is something that's just so fundamental to me. because what else is education for if you're not helping people to learn how to learn? If you learn how to learn and you get a lifelong love of learning, then it unlocks a curiosity, unlocks the sense that you can achieve lots of different things. Because if you want those skills, if you want to be able to do what she does or he does, then you can by learning. And you have the tools to do so, and you have the drive to do so, and you know that if you try, you will succeed. That is what kids should be leaving school with, that feeling of achievement should you apply yourself.
I wanted to ask you just about something else which I had to sort of read a few times to actually, I still don't think I understand it. So you were sent to, quote, a quack doctor, this was while you were a kid, who made me wear a wooden contraption on my head every evening. What?
Yeah, so after I said that publicly, my dad called me up and we spoke about it, because it was a school that sent me there. West Sussex, the county that I was educated in, they were the last, I remember them being the last county to recognise dyslexia, or one of the last. So they just it wasn't on their radar. The school knew that there was something wrong with me, they just didn't know what it was, so they were sending me off to all these different people for assessments, and it might well have been that my parents sent me off to get assessed. But anyway, this doctor gave me this wooden thing, which it was attached to my head, and it had two sort of handles, and you just extended and retracted, and you had to focus on the end of one, and you had to do this 10 times in the morning and 10 times at night. And now, my dad says that they thought I had a wobbly eye, and that would fix the wobbly eye. And once the wobbly eye is fixed, then everything else would just fall into place. But clearly they were looking, what they should have been looking at was a bit behind the eyes, because there was something neurological going on. But, there we go. There you go. I did as I was told. I was very earnest and, I tried. I did it for a few nights anyway, and then...
My goodness. My God, it's like medieval. Now, so you're 51, as I mentioned before. You've got a reading age of 8.
Yeah.
You are in the shadow cabinet. You are a successful member of parliament. You speak a lot in debates. You appear on television a fair amount for your party. What are the obstacles, or how do you do all those things?
Well, I learned at an early age, before I was even diagnosed. I was diagnosed in my 20s, my late 20s. I think I was 26, 27 when I was finally diagnosed. When I was at university, I handed in my first assignment, and a tutor just called me in to see him and then said, go and get a dyslexia test. And I did. And then when I got the test back, because what happens is you get a report. It's not straightforward, a yes or a no. You get a report on your abilities, on the challenges you have, the barriers, and also the advantages you have, because dyslexia is extremes. So there are some things that you are very accomplished at. There are other things that you really, really struggle with. So on word association, for example, I was off the charts. I was in the top 1 percentile. In some other things, like in comprehension and writing, I was in the bottom 2 or 3%. So just think of the extremes that means in your brain. When you actually, but when you're actually living it without knowing that, there are some things that are good at and some things you're bad at, but you don't see your life in those compartmentalized way, because you're doing word association plus you're doing writing and comprehension at the same time. So when you do get this granular data, and so much just fits into place. So I never kind of had this moment where I would be like, right, that means I have to do this and I have to do that. But the knowledge of your strengths and your weaknesses was just so empowering. And the fundamental thing was, I've always known, but I knew for certainty at that moment, I would always have to work harder than other people to achieve the same in certain circumstances. So I do. So when I was on the select committee, you know this from your time in Parliament, select committee meets once or twice a week. There's sometimes 150 pages of briefing before it. I would be sitting up longer in the evening to get that information into my head. But I've got tricks and tools that I've just developed. I'll be there with highlighter pens to remind me. I would be shortening certain sentences down. And I've got ways of getting that into my head. If I'm making a scripted speech, which is the most difficult thing that I'll do, then I'll just practice it more than others. And now I'm in the shadow cabinet. That's a more frequent experience. So I just have to, rehearse it and practice it more than others. There are certain words that you just stumble on. And I describe it like driving down a smooth road, and suddenly hitting a pothole that you didn't see coming. So, and everything shudders. and it's really uncomfortable, and it can be quite startling and quite difficult to recover from quite quickly. So those are the things that you have to. So when you rehearse a speech, when you read through a speech, the thing you're trying to do is to try and find those moments and just get them out, so that when you do it, you can have confidence from the start that you're going to get through it.
And you've never dried up. I've certainly never been aware of, when I was in Parliament with you, of you ever drying up. Just always thought, great speaker.
So that's very kind of you, thank you. Coming from you, who is an outstanding speaker, it's a real compliment. You know that when you're in those moments, your brain is often racing. Even Parliament and the Commons, even when it's calm, can be a really intimidating environment to speak in. So things in your head feel longer than it actually is. So you just get techniques. Part of the reason why I get very familiar with text before I read it from a written speech is that if those moments do happen, I usually have the knowledge in my head that I can carry on going, even if it's not being read from the speech. That happened with my maiden speech, where everything just disappeared off the page for a while, and everything was swimming. It was the first time I'd spoken there, and everything, and the nerves clearly played a part in it. And I just carried on going. And when you watch it back, you wouldn't notice the moment where I'm just doing it from the top of my head. And then if you can just relax a little bit, it kind of just comes back. But other times you just have to take a breath, and you'll do something which will give the impression of action, even though something's paused in your head for a while. So you just get used to these sorts of moments. But I think it's not. There are strengths to it as well. I mean, when I do oral questions, when I do short interventions in the Commons, it's very, very, very rare that I'll use a speech. When I do interviews, the thing that I do most before doing an interview is just try and understand the argument very, very deeply, so that I don't have to rely on notes to construct an argument, because it's very hard for me to read ahead, to speak and still be reading down the text. And I think that gives me, strengths in some interview situations. In other things, it's a challenge when you're doing an interview where there's loads of different topics, and you do want to have the party lines in your head for those moments. But it's very hard for me to remember the line. Well, it was very hard for me to remember the line, and I have no excuse. I want to ask you about your mum. Yeah.
So your mum, Jo, she was a dental nurse. Mm-hmm. When you were 18, tell us what happened to your mum.
Yeah, so my mum and dad were very different, came from different backgrounds. My dad, I adore both my mum and dad. My mum's not with us anymore. My dad came from, a really difficult, tough background. He grew up in what he calls a slum in Liverpool, left school at 14, became an apprentice stonemason to his dad. And also his granddad was working with his dad as well. So you can get this is up in Liverpool. You can see the kind of family that we were back then. He was in the Navy at 16. Mum had a slightly different background, but Dad was just the most driven person that I have ever come across in my life. He was going to get our family to somewhere different socially than he had set out from. So we were that classic family in the 80s that was just seizing every opportunity. Dad had a work ethic that was just extraordinary. When he left the Navy, he was a door-to-door salesman for Pilkington Glass up in Liverpool. He was going to night school in the evening. Every few years when I was born, which is down south, which is why my accent's different to his, every few years we were moving house, he was getting another car, we were moving forward. So even though we stayed in the same geographic area, we moved socially, a big distance. But I say this to explain that, my dad was very, very focused on that side of our family, the economic side of our family, the security side of our family life. I was therefore much, much closer to Mum than I was to Dad in those years, because I was just with Mum so much more, because Dad was so busy at work. So I adored Mum. I was incredibly close, and I was very, very attached to Mum. So at the age of 18, when I came home from work and there was a note on the table, I'd just started my first job. And I came home from work, and there's a note on the table which I just ignored, because it was quite a common thing to have a note on the table. And then Dad came home from work and then just, stood there shaking. And that was the moment we learned that she had eloped, run off, disappeared with my dad's best friend, somebody I considered my, like a second dad to me. I was that close to. So this was something that was deeply, deeply traumatizing, shocking, and incredibly difficult to deal with at the time, because not only was it very painful for me, to see your dad, who you adored so much, being put through so much pain as well, was something that was extremely difficult. And also for the other family that I was very close to. So it was a very, very difficult moment, no question.
Have you made peace with that moment?
It took a long time to make peace there. And, I lost my mum in 2012. And when she did, I didn't know where she was instantly for a few years. Her and the man who became her husband, disappeared off. And a few years later, it was just before my 21st birthday, I got a call from her, which I just put the phone down on. But there was a lot of pain that took a lot of time to deal with. And she didn't want to talk about that side of it, which made me even more angry. So we did meet, we did spend time together, but we had to learn how to just sort of reset the relationship and form a new one, which is very difficult when it's your mum, because she remembers me when I was born, obviously, from that very moment, and she wanted to kind of carry on there. But I needed, as an adult, to have a different relationship with her, which took into account that particular moment in time and the pain that caused, and it took a long time. But we had, she died of lung cancer that was misdiagnosed for 18 months. So by the time it was diagnosed, she had a very short amount of time left. But in that time, we had the chance to kind of exhibit the kind of behaviour and the attachment that had always been there, even though it's sometimes difficult to do. And we had some conversations that were not sentimental, but were quite direct. And one in particular, where we expressed our feelings for each other, which was just the most liberating moment. And I'm very, very, very grateful that we had those exchanges before she died. So I have fond memories of her. I wish so much that she was around to see me now, because she never found it difficult to express pride in her children, me and my brother, and that's something I think she would have taken huge pride in, the career opportunities that I've had and some of the success that I've had in public life, and I'd love for her to have seen it, because she was a big part of it.
She sounds great. What a story, what a life story. It's going to take some beating. Peter Kyle, thank you very much indeed.